She stepped into first class, and the air shifted. Not in any obvious way, no gasps or sudden silence, but in the little things. The way conversations softened, the flicker of a man's eyes as he glanced over his newspaper, the way a woman's fingers curled a little tighter around the handle of her designer bag. It was a reaction she had grown accustomed to all her life, one reserved for people like her in places like this. Evelyn Mercer walked with quiet confidence, her steps measured, her posture steady. But it didn't matter. Her presence had already spoken for her. She wasn't what they expected in first class. She wasn't what they wanted. And no one made that clearer than Olivia Grant. Olivia had greeted every other passenger with a warm smile, her voice smooth and professional, her every movement rehearsed to perfection. But the moment Evelyn stepped forward, the warmth faded, replaced by something colder. The politeness remained, but underneath it lay something unmistakable. A challenge, a dismissal, an unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Are you sure you belong here? Olivia never spoke the words aloud. She didn't have to. They were present in the hesitation before checking Evelyn's ticket, in the way she enunciated her words a little too carefully as if explaining something to a child, in the way she made sure that from the moment the plane took off, Evelyn would never forget that she was an outsider, a missing drink order, a sudden mix-up with the seat assignments, a meal tray that just happened to spill. Small things, little slights, but together they stacked up, forming a silent but heavy burden meant to weigh Evelyn down until she broke, until she accepted it, until she disappeared. But some people don't disappear so easily. And what happens when the woman you tried to erase turns out to be someone you never should have crossed? This is a story about arrogance, power, and the moment everything changes. Watch as those who believe they held control realize, too late, that they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. If you love stories of instant karma, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Have you ever witnessed injustice like this? What would you have done? And where are you watching from? Let us know. Evelyn Mercer stepped into the first-class cabin with quiet dignity, her steps steady despite the weight of years she carried. The space exuded exclusivity, rich Mahai accents, dim golden lighting, the faint but distinct scent of fresh leather and expensive cologne. Every detail was curated to ensure the passengers felt elite, untouchable. But as Evelyn approached, Olivia Grant, standing just beyond the threshold, had already decided she didn't belong. For the briefest moment, something flickered in Olivia's eyes, something sharp and dismissive. But in the next second, she smoothed her expression into a polite, impersonal mask. "Good evening, ma'am," Olivia said, her voice pleasant but distant. "Are you lost?" Evelyn didn't flinch. Without hesitation, she pulled out her ticket and handed it over. "Seat 2A." Olivia took the boarding pass between two fingers as if handling something fragile, something that didn't quite belong in her hands. She barely glanced at it before a smirk ghosted across her lips. "Oh," she murmured, her tone laced with something too mild to be outright rude, yet sharp enough to sting. She handed the ticket back, not into Evelyn's waiting palm, but instead, she let it drop onto the counter beside her. "I see," Olivia continued, the barest hint of amusement in her voice. "Well, let's get you settled." Evelyn bent slightly to retrieve the ticket, her movements controlled, composed. But the gesture wasn't lost on her. Olivia had made a deliberate choice not to return it properly, a minor act of power, disguised as carelessness. Turning toward the first-class section, Olivia took a slow step forward, but then, as if suddenly struck by a thought, she paused and pressed a finger to her headset. "Oh dear," she sighed, loud enough for others to hear, though she addressed no one in particular. "There might be an issue." Evelyn said nothing, but she could feel the subtle shift in the air. Olivia tapped at her tablet, feigning concern. "Looks like your ticket might have been flagged," she continued, her tone heavy with artificial sympathy. "Possibly a system error." She exhaled as though this were a great inconvenience. "I'm going to have to verify this before I can let you through." Evelyn's hands remained gently folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. "I booked this flight weeks ago," she said calmly. Olivia raised a single brow, her face revealing nothing. "I'm sure you did, ma'am," she replied smoothly. "We just need to double-check." Behind Evelyn, other passengers continued boarding, filing in without issue. Olivia ignored them all, her attention solely focused on delaying Evelyn, making sure she stood there long enough for every passing traveler to see her. A couple approached the entrance, middle-aged, well-dressed, exuding quiet wealth. Olivia's demeanor transformed in an instant. "Mr. and Mrs. Davenport," she greeted, her voice now warm, welcoming. "Right this way." She stepped aside effortlessly, allowing them to pass without even glancing at their tickets. Evelyn remained standing. A businessman nearby, noticing the scene, spared her a glance. His expression was difficult to read, but there was no malice in it, just quiet observation. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice neutral. Olivia turned to him with impeccable professionalism, adjusting her tone just enough to imply nothing was wrong, but something could be. "Oh, just a minor mix-up with seat assignments," she explained, her voice light, almost dismissive. "Happens sometimes when bookings get complicated." Evelyn's jaw tensed slightly at the implication. The businessman hesitated for a moment, as if considering pressing further, but in the end, he simply nodded and moved on. Olivia let a few more passengers pass, ensuring the pause dragged on, making Evelyn stand there just a little longer, before finally making a small noise of mock relief. "Ah, looks like everything's in order after all," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My mistake." She stepped aside, motioning toward the seats. "Right this way." Evelyn walked past her without a word, but she knew Olivia was watching, still gauging her reaction, still waiting for her to flinch, to shrink, to falter. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction. As Evelyn made her way down the aisle, she felt the eyes on her, some indifferent, some subtly judging. The whispers barely reached her ears, but she knew they were there. And then, trailing behind, Olivia added one final, carefully calculated remark. "It's always wonderful seeing more diversity in first class these days," she mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The words were crafted with precision, not overtly offensive, but deeply patronizing. A few passengers chuckled quietly. Evelyn took her seat, adjusting herself with poise. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests. The moment she sat down, Olivia disappeared, moving effortlessly down the aisle, tending to other guests as if nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Olivia had done nothing explicitly cruel. No raised voice, no outright insults. But she had turned Evelyn into a spectacle. And the worst part? She had done it all with a smile. Evelyn settled into her seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her posture poised despite the lingering tension in the air. The plane hadn't even taken off, but she could already feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her. Olivia had vanished down the aisle, tending to other passengers, but the damage had been done. She had been made into a spectacle. No harsh words had been spoken. No explicit cruelty had been displayed. But the whispers had started, the kind of murmurs that carried doubt, the kind that made people second-guess what they had seen. Evelyn could feel the subtle glances, some merely curious, others indifferent, but most laced with an unspoken message. You don't belong here. She had faced this before. In boardrooms filled with men who dismissed her, in meetings where her voice was ignored until it was repeated by someone else, in places where people believed her presence was a mistake. But this was different. This wasn't about business, strategy, or competition. This was humiliation. Plain and simple. A few rows ahead, Olivia lingered near the galley, tossing a quick glance over her shoulder as if debating her next move. Then, with a practiced flick of her hair, she turned toward the cabin. Her voice rang out, falsely pleasant, carefully modulated for maximum effect. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," Olivia called, ensuring every passenger heard her. "It seems we have a small seating issue." Evelyn tensed. Olivia's gaze landed on her, her expression carefully arranged to appear sympathetic. "Our dear passenger here seems to have mistakenly booked a first-class seat," Olivia continued smoothly. "If anyone would be willing to offer her a more suitable place in economy, we'd greatly appreciate it." A hush fell over the cabin. Conversations died down. The steady hum of the aircraft's ventilation suddenly felt deafening. Evelyn could feel the stares burning into her from all angles. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the tension, but unwilling to get involved. Others smirked behind their glasses of champagne, reveling in the spectacle. A man in a tailored navy suit, broad-shouldered, his belly pressing slightly against the buttons of his expensive jacket, let out a scoff. Richard Coleman. They really let just about anyone up here these days, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. A young woman near the front, Vanessa Green, dressed casually in designer wear, frowned slightly. But if she has a ticket, she asked, her voice hesitant, why does she need to move? Olivia, anticipating the question, was ready. She turned, flashing a rehearsed, almost pitying smile. Oh, there's no issue at all, she assured Vanessa. We just want to ensure that all passengers have the most comfortable experience possible. Then she added the finishing touch, the words meant to sound reasonable, but designed to sting. And let's be honest, Olivia said with a small chuckle, some passengers might find first class a bit overwhelming. Evelyn felt the weight of that sentence settle over her like a lead blanket. The young woman hesitated, shifting in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to press further. Richard Coleman, emboldened, leaned forward slightly, his smirk widening. Maybe she's someone's grandmother using a gifted ticket, he mused. Happens all the time. A few passengers chuckled, the kind of quiet laughter meant to wound. Olivia gave an apologetic shrug. Well, we do our best to accommodate all types of travelers, she said lightly, her gaze flicking back to Evelyn. We just want her to have a smooth experience. Without any discomfort. The word discomfort lingered, a taunt disguised as kindness. A long silence stretched between them. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, Olivia turned toward Danielle, the younger flight attendant near the service cart. Danielle, could you check if we have any open seats in economy? Olivia asked, her tone sweet but firm. It's probably best if we relocate her to avoid any further confusion. Danielle hesitated. Her hands tightened around the cart handle, her knuckles going white. Danielle started, then swallowed. There aren't any open seats. A flicker of irritation passed over Olivia's face, but she masked it quickly, turning back to the passengers with a helpless shrug. Well, she said, her voice syrupy, looks like she's staying. The way she said it made it clear. This was not a right. It was a pity. Evelyn remained silent, though she felt the pressure of every unspoken judgment pressing down on her. She had spent decades proving herself in rooms where she wasn't wanted. But here, stripped of her title, stripped of the respect she had worked for, she wasn't a leader, wasn't a pioneer. She was just an old woman being allowed to remain. And Olivia was making sure she knew it. Olivia wasn't finished. Turning back to Danielle, she gave a small, knowing smile. Make sure she gets extra assistance during the flight, she instructed smoothly. We wouldn't want her to struggle with the first-class amenities. A few chuckles rippled through the cabin. Danielle's face burned with discomfort, but she nodded. Of course. Satisfied, Olivia finally moved on, gliding down the aisle as if nothing had happened. Conversations resumed, champagne glasses clinked, and the hum of luxury filled the air once again. Evelyn remained still, her back straight, fingers intertwined on her lap. To them, she had already been forgotten. But Olivia wasn't done. She strolled down the aisle leisurely before stopping near Evelyn's seat, tapping her manicured nails against the leather headrest of an empty chair. You know, Olivia mused, her voice light, since there was so much confusion earlier, I think it's only fair that we make sure everyone is exactly where they belong. Her eyes flicked toward the galley, where a young, well-dressed man stood. He was in his early 30s, effortlessly confident, the kind of person who fits seamlessly into a world of privilege. Nathan Carter, Olivia called, flashing a bright, professional smile. Since you were upgraded last minute, would you mind taking seat 2A? It's one of our best. Nathan blinked, glancing toward the seat in question, Evelyn's original seat. Evelyn's posture stiffened. She knew what was coming before Olivia even turned to face her. Mrs. Mercer, Olivia sighed, her tone dripping with false patience. Would you be willing to switch seats? Mr. Carter was just moved to first class, and we want to give him the best experience possible. I'm sure you understand. Evelyn finally looked up, her face unreadable. I was already asked to move once. Olivia's smile didn't falter. Yes, but this is different. This is about hospitality. Nathan hesitated, sensing the quiet tension in the air. I don't mind. Oh, nonsense, Olivia cut in smoothly. We want you to be comfortable. She turned back to Evelyn, her voice taking on a note of condescension. And let's be honest, you might find a different seat more suited to your needs. Evelyn didn't respond, not that she was given a choice. With a rehearsed gesture, Olivia motioned toward an inferior seat in the last row of first class, a cramped spot near the aisle, right where flight attendants frequently passed. "We have a wonderful seat right there," Olivia continued, her smile unwavering. "Still first class, of course. Just more convenient for everyone." A few passengers looked up now, sensing the quiet spectacle unfolding before them. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy with being placed in the middle of something that felt wrong. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment before slowly rising from her seat. She wasn't given a choice. Olivia clapped her hands together. "Wonderful. Thank you for being so understanding." Evelyn moved deliberately, each step careful, controlled. She held her head high, even as the heat of humiliation burned beneath her skin. She sank into the new seat, stiff and unyielding, the reduced space pressing in around her. Nathan sat down in her former seat, glancing at her once more before shifting awkwardly in place. But Olivia wasn't done. She turned back, placing her hands on her hips, eyes expectant. "Oh, one last thing," she added brightly, as if it had just occurred to her. "Would you mind apologizing for the confusion? We wouldn't want any misunderstandings lingering." The words hit like a slap. Evelyn's hands curled into fists in her lap. The air around her thickened with silence. Passengers turned away, suddenly deeply interested in their magazines, their meals, their own thoughts. No one spoke up, no one intervened. Olivia's smile sharpened. "Mrs. Mercer?" Evelyn's throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I apologize for any inconvenience." Olivia beamed, tilting her head slightly. "See? That wasn't so hard." She gave a satisfied nod before striding away, leaving Evelyn in the suffocating quiet of her diminished place. But Olivia made sure she wasn't truly alone. She passed by more than once, never looking directly at Evelyn, but each time she did, her shoulder brushed just slightly against Evelyn's arm, a small, calculated reminder that she was in the way. Passengers around her reclined comfortably, sipping champagne, flipping through stock reports, enjoying the curated elegance of first class. Evelyn sat rigid, hands in her lap, waiting. Soon, Olivia reappeared, this time pushing the food cart, her expression perfectly neutral. She moved with practiced ease, serving each passenger with flawless precision, engaging in effortless small talk. But when she reached Evelyn, her movements slowed. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness. "We have a lovely selection today. I assume you'd prefer something soft, maybe soup?" She let the words linger, an unmistakable jab at Evelyn's age. Evelyn met Olivia's gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'll take the chicken." Olivia lifted a brow as if surprised, but she said nothing. She reached for the meal tray, hesitating just a fraction of a second before lowering it onto Evelyn's table. A little harder than necessary. "Enjoy," Olivia murmured, before smoothly pushing the cart forward, already moving on. But Evelyn knew this wasn't over, not yet. Evelyn sat stiffly, her breath measured, her fingers gripping the napkins that now lay in a crumpled heap in her lap. The stain on her pants had already set, the warmth of the spilled food long faded, but the weight of the humiliation lingered. Olivia had moved on, her performance complete, for now. The cabin returned to its polished, indulgent routine. Glasses clinked softly, murmured conversations resumed, and business travelers flipped through their stock reports, unbothered. To them, Evelyn was no longer a person. She was a moment, a passing curiosity, a forgotten inconvenience. But Olivia wasn't done. With a slow, deliberate grace, she made her way back down the aisle, a thin smirk curving at the edges of her lips. She stopped beside Evelyn's seat, tilting her head thoughtfully, tapping her manicured nails against the leather headrest of the empty chair beside her. "You know," Olivia mused, her voice syrupy sweet, "since you're already cleaning up after yourself, why don't you be a dear and help us out?" She lifted an empty tray from the cart, extending it toward Evelyn just enough to ensure that nearby passengers could see. A murmur of amusement rippled through the cabin. "I mean," Olivia continued, her lips twitching as if suppressing a laugh, "I assume you're used to this kind of work." A sharp breath was drawn somewhere nearby. A quiet, stifled chuckle followed. Evelyn remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes locked on the seat in front of her as if Olivia did not exist. That only encouraged her. Olivia tilted her head, feigning concern. "Oh dear, did I overestimate you?" At your age, I imagine heavy lifting isn't exactly ideal. The chuckles grew louder. A man across the aisle, Henry Whitmore, a businessman with silver hair and a polished watch, smirked. He leaned slightly toward his seatmate, his voice low but intentionally loud enough to be overheard. Maybe she can't hear too well either, he murmured. Another wave of laughter, hushed but pointed. Olivia widened her eyes in mock realization. Oh, of course. My apologies, Mrs. Mercer. Her tone dripped with insincere sweetness. I shouldn't have assumed. She let her gaze drift over Evelyn's simple, elegant clothing, her expression shifting into something bordering amusement. I suppose hard work was never really your thing. Evelyn didn't move, but Olivia was watching closely, hungry for a reaction. She gave a small, knowing chuckle. Unless, of course, you had a career in service? Olivia gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. Wait, don't tell me. You worked in aviation, didn't you? Evelyn's fingers twitched ever so slightly. The only betrayal of emotion. Olivia grinned. She turned slightly toward the nearest passengers as if sharing a delightful secret. Can you imagine 40 years in the industry? Olivia let out a low, mocking whistle. Now that's dedication. She turned back to Evelyn, her eyes glittering with cruel amusement. Let me guess, Olivia continued, barely containing her smirk. Did you work the front desk, count baggage tickets? Maybe? She trailed off, eyes gleaming with faux curiosity. Maybe you pushed the drink cart, just like me? A low chuckle rolled through the cabin, passengers emboldened by Olivia's performance. And Evelyn, silent still, felt every word, but she would not break. Not yet. A soft chuckle rippled through the cabin, emboldening the passengers. Someone from the back, their voice laced with casual cruelty, added, more like scrubbing floors in the terminals. Laughter followed, effortless, detached, people amusing themselves at her expense. Evelyn inhaled slowly, controlled. But Olivia wasn't finished. Leaning in slightly, just close enough that only Evelyn could hear, she lowered her voice to a whisper, warm against the cool air. Or maybe, Olivia murmured, her tone silky with malice. You were just one of those sad little people who pretended to have power while the real bosses made all the decisions. The silence between them thickened, suffocating. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but her gaze remained forward, unwavering. Olivia, unwilling to let the moment pass without pressing deeper, tapped the tray against the side of the seat. So, Mrs. Mercer, she said, her voice bright, mockingly cheerful. Are you going to help out, or is that beneath you now? Evelyn didn't move. Olivia let the pause stretch just long enough to turn discomfort into true humiliation before she sighed dramatically and straightened. That's too bad, she mused, then turned on her heel, sauntering back toward the galley, her voice carrying over her shoulder. I thought you'd at least want to relive the good old days. More laughter followed her departure, blending seamlessly into the soft clinking of glasses and hushed conversations, as if nothing had happened at all. Evelyn remained still, her breath steady, her expression unreadable, but beneath her ribs, something tightened. It wasn't just the humiliation of the present, it was the way Olivia had reached back, ripping through decades of Evelyn's life, dismantling everything she had built, everything she had fought for, reducing it to nothing more than a joke. Olivia had enjoyed herself far more than she had expected. But she wasn't finished. As the dinner service wound down, she moved through the aisle with the grace of someone entirely in control, flashing effortless smiles at the elite passengers, making it a point to ignore the woman she had turned into a punchline. Then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Evelyn rose slowly from her seat, steadying herself with a hand on the armrest before making her way toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. Olivia paused, a slow, cruel smirk ghosting across her lips. Timing was everything. Evelyn entered the lavatory, closing the door behind her. The moment she heard the lock click, Olivia moved. With practiced ease, she stepped forward, slipping a discreet security key from her pocket, a tool that every flight attendant carried, allowing them to unlock the lavatory doors from the outside. But she didn't unlock it. With a lazy flick of her wrist, she twisted the mechanism and jammed the lock, sealing Evelyn inside. A slow satisfaction settled deep in Olivia's chest. Minutes passed. Passengers came and went, yet no one questioned the locked door. The longer Evelyn stayed inside, the more ridiculous it would seem. The image was perfect. An old woman taking an eternity in the restroom, helpless, invisible, forgotten. At the 40-minute mark, someone finally spoke up. A woman near the front, Margaret Collins, well-dressed, middle-aged, gestured toward the door. "Excuse me, is that occupied? It's been quite a while." Olivia barely looked up from her tablet. "Oh," she said lightly, allowing a carefully measured pause to pass before adding, "Mrs. Mercer went in earlier." Then, with a small, delicate shrug, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to imply something uncomfortable. "You know how it is." Margaret's brow furrowed. "How what is?" Olivia offered a sympathetic smile, voice dipping into false concern. "Older passengers," she murmured. "Sometimes they take longer." Margaret's expression flickered between mild concern and quiet distaste, but she said nothing. And no one else pressed the issue. By the time an hour had passed, Evelyn's patience had worn thin. She knocked on the inside of the door, testing the lock again. It wouldn't budge. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear but from a growing, quiet rage. She knocked harder. "Hello?" Olivia took her time. Let her knock. Let her wait. Let her feel the weight of helplessness settle over her. Finally, after deciding that Evelyn had spent enough time trapped, Olivia strolled forward, feigning mild surprise as she rattled the door handle. "Oh dear," she mused, her tone light, playful. "Did the lock stick?" With exaggerated ease, she twisted the key, pulling the door open effortlessly. "You must have jammed it, Mrs. Mercer." Evelyn stepped forward, her face unreadable, but Olivia saw it, the flicker of fury beneath her carefully controlled expression. That only made it more enjoyable. Before Evelyn could pass, Olivia angled her body slightly, blocking the narrow space. Then, in a voice low enough that only Evelyn could hear, she murmured, "Before you go back to your seat, I think you owe me something." Evelyn stilled. Olivia's voice remained light, casual, like she was discussing the weather. "You were in there quite a while," she mused. "Had the whole cabin waiting." Her fingers lightly tapped against the door frame. "Don't you think you should apologize?" Passengers were watching. Evelyn could feel it. Some weren't paying full attention, but a few nearby were eyeing the exchange, waiting to see what she would do. Olivia smiled. "It's the polite thing to do, Mrs. Mercer." A simple, quiet sorry would be enough, wouldn't it? The moment stretched, suffocating in its weight. Olivia leaned in slightly, her breath barely a whisper. "If you want to go back to your seat, that is." Evelyn's fingers curled into invisible fists at her sides, her breath measured, controlled. But the humiliation pressed down on her like an unseen weight. Olivia waited, smug and expectant. Finally, Evelyn lifted her gaze and met Olivia's eyes. "Not yet," she told herself, "not here." "I'm sorry." Olivia's smile widened, her victory complete. She stepped aside smoothly, gesturing toward the aisle. "See? That wasn't so hard." Evelyn walked past her, shoulders squared, steps slow and deliberate. Olivia watched her go, basking in the satisfaction. Evelyn had just apologized for being trapped. Evelyn returned to her seat, her movements careful, precise. Her body remained tense, shoulders squared, but the moment she sat down, she felt the weight of countless unseen eyes pressing against her. The whispers had started again. Soft, sharp murmurs cut through the thick air of first class, slicing into her with quiet judgment. Olivia walked past, a satisfied smirk curling at the edges of her lips. She moved gracefully through the aisle, adjusting trays, straightening blankets that didn't need fixing, making it painfully clear that she was still watching. Every now and then she let out a soft scoff, just audible enough for others to notice. Then, as if on cue, she sighed dramatically, letting her manicured nails tap against the cart, drawing subtle attention before she spoke. "You know," Olivia mused, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard, "I think it's sad when people can't accept reality." She let the words linger, savoring the tension. "Some people just don't know when their time is up," she continued, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "They cling to things that aren't meant for them anymore." Across the aisle, a man swirled the amber liquid in his whiskey glass before letting out a low chuckle. "David Lancaster." "You'd think she'd take the hint by now," he muttered to his seatmate. Olivia hummed in agreement. "Some people just can't let go," she mused, shaking her head as though the thought genuinely saddened her. Maybe it's because they used to be important, or at least, they thought they were. She turned then, letting her gaze land directly on Evelyn, her expression unreadable, her smile never faltering. "But that was a long time ago." Evelyn's grip on the armrest tightened. Olivia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to twist the knife. "Mrs. Mercer," she cooed, her tone deceptively sweet. "Do you still think you matter?" The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. The question itself was a sentence, a final stamp of degradation. Olivia straightened, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from her uniform as if brushing away the remnants of an insignificant encounter. "I suppose we all have our delusions," she sighed airily before turning away. But she wasn't done. Taking a step toward the intercom, Olivia pressed a button discreetly. A deep voice crackled through the speakers. "Miss Grant, please report to the galley." With an exaggerated sigh, Olivia turned back toward the passengers, flashing them an apologetic smile. "Duty calls," she announced with an air of mock regret. She made her way toward the front, but not before casting Evelyn one last look. A look that said, "You don't belong here, you never did." Minutes passed. When Olivia returned, she wasn't alone. 2 uniformed security officers trailed behind her. Officer Reynolds, Officer Carter. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. The whispers in first class stopped entirely. Evelyn remained seated, her posture composed, her face giving away nothing. Olivia stood beside the officers, her hands neatly clasped in front of her, her voice as smooth as ever. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, her tone polite but firm, "these gentlemen need to have a word with you." Evelyn looked at them, then at Olivia. And for the first time since the flight began, a flicker of steel entered her gaze. Olivia smiled. "You've been causing a bit of a disturbance," she continued lightly, her tone perfectly reasonable. "Unfortunately, we can't allow that on a flight like this." Her voice dipped into something almost gentle, as though she were explaining a simple truth. "It's for everyone's safety. You understand." A murmur ran through the cabin. The kind of silent judgment that settled when people decided it was easier to accept what they were told than to question it. Evelyn knew exactly what was happening. Olivia wasn't removing her because she had done something wrong. She was removing her because this was the final step, stripping her of every last shred of dignity. One of the officers shifted slightly. "Ma'am," Officer Carter said evenly, "we'd like to escort you off the plane." Evelyn held her ground, but she could feel it, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had been humiliated, isolated, mocked, forced to apologize for existing. And now they were taking the final thing left, her presence. Olivia exhaled as if disappointed. "I really hoped we wouldn't have to do this," she said, shaking her head in feigned regret. Then she turned to the officers. "Please escort her out." Evelyn Mercer had been erased banks. Officer Reynolds took a step forward. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "we'd like to escort you off the plane." Olivia tilted her head, feigning concern. "Of course," she added, her voice deceptively soft. "If you just agree to quiet down and cooperate, I'm sure we could reconsider." Evelyn understood exactly what she meant. Apologize. Again. Accept your place. Or leave. She had been humiliated, isolated, stripped of the past she had built, forced to apologize for simply existing. And now they were taking the last thing she had left, her presence. The weight of it all pressed down on her. For a brief moment, silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Olivia exhaled dramatically, shaking her head as if disappointed. "I really hoped we wouldn't have to do this," she sighed. Then she turned to the officers, gesturing toward the aisle. "Please escort her out." A hush fell over first class. Passengers sat upright, their gazes flitting between Evelyn and the security officers. Whispers swelled, a ripple of quiet expectation. Evelyn, however, remained still. Her expression unreadable, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Then, just as Officer Carter moved to take another step forward, a voice cut through the silence. "Wait." It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that sliced through the tension like a blade. Heads turned. A distinguished man in his 60s, sharp suit impeccable, eyes keen and calculating, had risen from his seat. Jonathan Hayes. He didn't look at Olivia. His gaze was locked onto Evelyn. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Then, something colder. Something dangerously close to fear. Olivia, momentarily thrown off, forced a polite smile. "Sir, please remain seated," she said smoothly. "We are handling." "You're not handling anything," Jonathan interrupted, his voice low but firm. Olivia faltered, her mouth opening slightly before hesitating. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that made her uneasy. Before she could recover, another voice, sharper and more urgent, rang out. "Captain." The lead pilot had appeared at the entrance of first class. Captain Mitchell. His uniform was crisp, but his face had gone pale. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on Evelyn. Then they darted toward the security report in Officer Reynolds' hands. The moment he read her name, his entire expression shifted, his composure breaking into something dangerously close to horror. His grip on the coffee cup in his hand tightened, then slipped entirely. Porcelain shattered onto the floor. Several passengers flinched at the sound, but Captain Mitchell didn't move. His focus was solely on Evelyn. Olivia barely had time to register his reaction before he turned sharply toward the officers. "Stand down." The command was absolute. The officers hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. Then Captain Mitchell's voice dropped into something razor-sharp. "Now." They immediately stepped back. Olivia's stomach twisted. "Captain, Shut up." The words were so sharp, so cold, that Olivia instinctively recoiled. The power dynamic in the cabin had shifted so fast it left her dizzy. Evelyn, still silent, watched it unfold with a steady gaze. Jonathan Hayes exhaled sharply, shaking his head before turning to Olivia. His tone was laced with dark amusement. "Tell me something, Miss Grant," he said, drawing out her name as if it tasted bitter in his mouth. "Do you have any idea who you've been humiliating for the past few hours?" Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. She knew she had crossed lines, but the way he said it, the way everyone was looking at her now, made her skin crawl. "That's not..." she started, but her voice faltered. Jonathan didn't wait for her to finish. He turned to face the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice steady and firm, "allow me to introduce you to Evelyn Mercer." The name landed like a thunderclap. Passengers stiffened, gasps escaped in hushed disbelief. Someone swore under their breath. In the second row, Eleanor Brooks clutched her pearls, her wide eyes darting between Evelyn and Olivia, horror dawning on her face. Near the aisle, Charles Whitaker muttered, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Olivia stood frozen, her breath coming too fast, her brain scrambling to process what was happening. Captain Mitchell straightened, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Ms. Mercer," he said. The respect in his tone a sharp contrast to the way she had been spoken to all flight, "is the founder and chairwoman of this airline." Olivia's heart stopped. The security officers stiffened, stepping away from Evelyn as if proximity alone could ruin them. The passengers who had laughed at her, mocked her, suddenly looked as if they wanted to disappear into their seats. Olivia's throat tightened, her limbs turned ice cold. This wasn't possible. It wasn't real. But the way everyone was looking at her, the way the captain had reacted, the way Evelyn Mercer sat there perfectly composed, unshaken, it was real. And she had just spent hours tearing down the most powerful woman in the airline industry. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was calm, precise. "I believe," she said, her tone like silk, "you were about to have me removed from my own plane." Olivia's lips parted, but no sound came out. The weight of every stair in the cabin pressed into her, suffocating, crushing. Her breath turned shallow. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. The silence was deafening, a void filled only by the low hum of the aircraft. Evelyn hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even needed to demand justice. Yet justice was already coming for her. The intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Mitchell," came the steady voice, though an unmistakable edge cut through it. "We have an urgent matter." The intercom cut off abruptly, but the damage was done. Olivia's breath came fast and shallow as she gripped the back of a seat for balance. Her vision tunneled, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. Across the cabin, Danielle, the junior flight attendant, stared at her in horror. Danielle took a slow step back, shaking her head. "They're going to fire you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs spreading through first class. Olivia's mouth opened, a sharp denial forming on her tongue. No, they wouldn't dare. But the way the passengers were looking at her now, like she was filth, like she wasn't even worth the air in this cabin. The security officers who had once been ready to remove Evelyn now stood frozen, their faces unreadable, their bodies stiff, waiting for orders. Then, through the overhead speakers, a voice crackled, firm and final. "Miss Grant is hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately." Olivia's breath hitched. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. No, wait. But the pilot stepped forward, his face devoid of sympathy. Miss Grant, he said coolly, you are no longer authorized to perform duties on this flight. Step away from the passengers and return to the galley. A hush fell over the cabin. A few gasps rippled through the rows. A businessman who had laughed at Evelyn earlier quickly averted his gaze, unwilling to be associated with the now disgraced flight attendant. A woman clutched her designer purse as if Olivia's downfall was something contagious. Desperate, Olivia turned, searching for support. None came. Danielle was staring at her like she was a cautionary tale, one wrong move away from being erased herself. The security officers had taken a step back, deliberately distancing themselves from her. And Evelyn Mercer, she sat perfectly still, calm, composed. Powerful, like a queen deciding the fate of a peasant who had dared overstep. The landing was the longest of Olivia's life. The passengers were no longer whispering about Evelyn. They were whispering about her. She felt their eyes crawling over her skin, their judgment pressing into her spine. Every bump in the descent made her stomach churn. Every shift in altitude was a countdown to the end of everything. When the wheels finally touched the runway, Olivia gripped the seat beside her, her fingers white with tension. A second later, a voice came over the intercom. Cabin crew, please remain seated. Except she wasn't cabin crew anymore. The doors opened. Olivia forced herself to stand, to smooth her uniform, to pretend she still had control. Then she saw them. Two uniformed officers stood just outside the gate, their eyes locked onto her. A collective inhale swept through first class. Someone whispered something, barely suppressing a smile. Olivia's knees nearly buckled. She turned, desperate one last time, to Danielle, to the passengers, to anyone who might save her. No one did. She was alone. She'd been alone the whole time. One of the officers stepped forward. Olivia Grant? Olivia's throat tightened. Yes, she managed barely above a whisper. You are to come with us. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh. Are you kidding me? You can't. We can, the officer interrupted, and we will. A hand landed on her arm, not rough but firm. Final. The reality crashed over her like a wave. Olivia Grant, who had strutted through this cabin as though she owned the air itself, was now being escorted off the plane like a criminal. As she was led past first class, past the passengers she had once controlled, manipulated, humiliated, she caught a final glimpse of Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. Calm, unbothered, the weight of absolute power resting effortlessly on her shoulders. Olivia walked through the terminal, her uniform stiff against her skin, the weight of every step heavier than the last. The murmurs followed her. Curious glances, hushed whispers, the occasional click of a phone camera capturing her disgrace. The first-class passengers had already disembarked, moving through the airport like they still belonged. Olivia, however, was being dragged forward like an afterthought. A warning, a mistake that no one would make again. At the security checkpoint, a supervisor approached, a man in a dark suit, a tablet in hand, his face unreadable. Mr. Patel, he glanced at the officers, then at Olivia. Miss Grant, he said, his tone flat. Your employment with the airline has been terminated, effective immediately. Olivia's breath caught. No. Your access to all airline properties is revoked, Patel continued. You are barred from reapplying or working in any capacity within our aviation network. He barely paused before delivering the final blow. Your flight privileges are also permanently revoked. The words knocked the air from her lungs. She stumbled slightly. Wait. Mr. Patel barely acknowledged her protest. This includes commercial, private, and partner airline travel, he stated. As of now, you are banned from flying indefinitely. The world lurched beneath her feet. Flying had been her life. It wasn't just a job. It was who she was. The uniform, the authority. The world above the clouds where she dictated who mattered and who didn't. It was all gone. Her hands clenched at her sides. You can't do that. But Mr. Patel was already walking away. Because there was nothing left to discuss. Olivia Grant had been grounded, forever. Olivia stood there, trapped in a moment that stretched endlessly, the weight of her downfall pressing down on her like a burial shroud. Somewhere in the airport, reporters were gathering. The news had already broken. The scandal had spread faster than turbulence in a storm, and every headline carried her name, but not in the way she had ever imagined. Flight attendant humiliates airline CEO, gets fired mid-flight. Power trip gone wrong. Olivia Grant's career ends in disgrace. Evelyn Mercer speaks out. Airline implements zero-tolerance policy. A cold sweat prickled down Olivia's spine. She turned, dazed, her mind still struggling to catch up with the catastrophe she had created. And then she saw her. Evelyn Mercer stood at the far end of the terminal, surrounded by executives and press, her presence commanding but effortless. The woman Olivia had mocked, had belittled, had stripped of dignity. Yet now, Evelyn was untouched, untarnished. The world had not turned against her. It had turned against Olivia. A voice cut through the noise. "Mrs. Mercer, can you comment on the incident?" Melissa Carter, a reporter from a major network, held a microphone out, cameras rolling. Evelyn adjusted the cuffs of her tailored jacket, her voice smooth but unwavering. "No one," she said, "has the right to decide who deserves respect based on their age, appearance, or assumptions." She let the words settle, her tone calm but absolute. "That's why, as of today, we are implementing strict policies to remove individuals who abuse their position of power." For the briefest moment, her gaze flicked toward Olivia. "This industry," she said, her voice unwavering, "will be cleaned from the inside out." The final blow was delivered. Calmly, professionally, publicly, ensuring that Olivia Grant would never work in aviation again. Olivia staggered back, the weight of it all finally crashing over her. It was over. Everything was over. And Evelyn hadn't even needed to raise her voice. Olivia turned, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the stares, the cameras, the unrelenting realization that she had built her own downfall with her own hands. She had ruled the skies, now she couldn't even board a plane.